Welcome, everyone, to our second act program, The Formula for Successful Aging with Dr. Gary Small. My name is Gloria Coe, and I serve as the Senior Director for Alumni Career Engagement here at the UCLA Alumni Association. Today's program is part of our second act program where we feature speakers and panels to address topics of interest to our alumni 50 and above. The second act program started in the fall of 2016, designed to offer Bruins in their fifth decade of life and beyond the opportunities and resources to engage, learn, optimize their health, volunteer, and invest in themselves. I want to take a moment to thank our alumni sustaining donors. It is with your help that we are able to provide webinars such as these. We also want to thank our official banking partner, Westcom Credit Union, for supporting the Second Act program and helping the Bruin community build better lives. So go to ucla.westcom.org for more information. Before we get started, I want to share some general housekeeping for the webinar. We will utilize the Q&A chat that's at the bottom of your screen for questions. So if you have any questions, Dr. Small will be taking questions at the end of his presentation, so you can utilize the Q&A function below to add in your question for him. If you should need closed captioning, you can also select the closed caption option below at the bottom of your Zoom screen to turn that on for yourselves. Now, I want to introduce Jen Wells, our Chief of Staff of Alumni Engagement, for a quick welcome.
Hello, everyone. It is really great that you are joining us today. My name is Jen Wells. I'm the Chief of Staff for Alumni Engagement and really excited to see so many of you on this call. As Gloria mentioned, the UCLA Alumni Association serves alumni across all life stages with our second act program, really focusing on those over 50 and making sure that we're providing engaging and relevant programming. So we're really glad to see you in this virtual space. We hope that you'll continue to stay engaged throughout your time and continue to utilize the wonderful resources that we're offering here at the Alumni Association. We know that Bruins help Bruins. We know that Bruins are really connecting with one another, especially during these times. And so thank you for being here, and we hope to see you continue to engage.
Thank you, Jen. And now just also for a quick welcome from our network's partners, I want to introduce Sharon Rowlands and Karen McLean from the Westwood Women Bruins Club and the Town and Gown affiliates to share a little bit about their network, and also they will be introducing Dr. Small. So Sharon, you can go first.
Thank you, Gloria. Westwood Women's Bruin Club is an organization that was formed back in the 1940s to foster and encourage the interest of graduates, former students, and friends of UCLA to get together and discuss their love of learning and students. And it started as a social club. It became much more. Now we have students from we do scholarships. We get together for monthly luncheons and lectures, and we provide an atmosphere to encourage these students and mentor them as they go, and we provide scholarships for them. And we really enjoy doing it. They're wonderful. And we love working with UCLA. That's it. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Karen McLean. I'm a Senior Director here in Alumni, working with alumni communities and leadership development, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Town and Gown affiliates. The Town and Gown affiliates of UCLA has been supporting the university and surrounding Los Angeles community since 1937. Town represents the Los Angeles community, and gown is for the robes, denoting academia's highest honors and degrees. The affiliates support UCLA students with scholarships. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gary Small. Gary Small is an internationally renowned psychiatrist, neuroscientist, and expert on brain aging. Alzheimer's disease, and dementia prevention. He was among the team of investigators involved in the discovery of the major known genetic risk for Alzheimer's disease and was a co-inventor of the first positron emission tomography scanning method that can provide images in living people of the abnormal brain proteins in Alzheimer's disease. He was professor of psychiatry and director of the UCLA Longevity Center until 2020, when he became a professor and chair of psychiatry at Hackensack Meridian School of Medicine, chair of psychiatry at Hackensack University Medical Center. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gary Small.
Thank you, Karen. It's lovely to be back at UCLA, and I appreciate everyone taking time to hear what I have to say today. Let me just try to begin by sharing my screen. This is my first cognitive test of the day to work the technology here. See how I do. Oh, looks like I'm passing. And we're going to be talking about successful aging. So you heard about my bio. I was an undergraduate at UCLA. Then I went east to medical school, USC, then went further east to Boston to train in psychiatry, and then returned to UCLA for most of my career. And in 2020, I guess I started my second act. A headhunter weakened me and recruited me to the East Coast for a very exciting, interesting job. I neglected to check the climate out there, so it is good to be back with all of you here today, even though it's virtual. So let's begin. I'll just show you my disclosures and potential conflicts of interest currently, and then get into the meat of the talk. And I'm going to try to ask and answer these two questions. First, do we have any control over our brain health as we age? And secondly, if we do, what can we do to forestall cognitive decline and optimize mind health? I mean, this is something at the top of everyone's mind. I'm very concerned about. And let's begin with this woman who's quite famous in gerontology, Madame Jeanne Calment. Some of you are, I'm sure, familiar with her. She's a woman who grew up in the south of France. She was quite active physically and mentally throughout her life, and consumed the Mediterranean diet, which we know is great for your heart. It's also great for your brain. When let's see, she was born in 1875. This is what makes her extraordinary. And she died in 1997. So this is your first cognitive test of this webinar. How old was she when she passed? And you can do those calculations silently. And any of you came up with 122, you passed that test. What's extraordinary was that when she passed away, she did not have dementia or Alzheimer's. She had the brain of a healthy 80-year-old. They did a scan prior to her death. And so she, in some ways, was following the formula for successful aging. In fact, she was quite an astute businesswoman. At the age of 94, she sold her apartment. I think it was in Arles, France. It was a very nice apartment. She sold it to a French businessman who agreed to pay her rent for the rest of her life. This when she was 94. And this businessman died 10 years later. So she did very well on that. But when she passed, his estate did gain the apartment. So what is the formula? I mean, you can summarize it in many ways. Here's 5 important areas: optimal healthcare. If you're an alumnus of UCLA and you're using UCLA, it's a wonderful health system. You're probably getting that if you listen to your doctor. We're going to talk about physical activity, how important that is, mental exercise, stress management, and a healthy diet. But there are other iterations of this. We'll talk about social connectedness, which of course helps with stress and helps us with mental exercise, sleep, other factors that are very important. But what's on everybody's mind is Alzheimer's disease. And let's just briefly summarize what that is. It was described for the first time in 1906 by Alois Alzheimer. He presented the first case to the medical community. A woman at the age of 51 who was confused and had rapid progression of her confusion. She died 4 years later. And what Alzheimer did that was new was to apply special stains to the autopsy tissue, the autopsy tissue after her death. And you can see the plaques and tangles, or what we call amyloid plaques and tau tangles under the microscope. Now, the medical community didn't get too excited about it because this woman became confused in her 50s. So it was thought to be the cause of rare presenile dementias. But in 1968, neuropathologists looked at the brains of a group of older individuals who had what we used to call senility. We used to assume as people reached old age, they just lost their cognitive abilities, and that was normal. But it turned out they saw those same amyloid plaques and tau tangles in areas of the brain that control thinking and memory. So now we had an epidemic of late onset Alzheimer's disease, which certainly troubled the public. But the silver lining was that it motivated scientists and physicians to look for better ways to diagnose it and to treat it. So if you look at an Alzheimer brain, it is atrophied or shrunken compared to a normal older brain. And the insets show you those collections of the plaques and the tangles in areas like the frontal lobe, the thinking brain, temporal lobe, or hippocampus, and memories are stored. But notice the insets from the normal brain. You see an occasional plaque and tangle. And it turns out, as we study this, we find that these abnormal deposits that define the disease build up over a lifetime. And we can track some of these issues directly, the plaques and tangles, with blood markers. Now they're becoming quite sensitive and specific, some of the blood tests for Alzheimer's disease. We also have genetics that inform us, and also lumbar punctures giving us cerebral spinal fluid, giving us information. You can also look at brain structure through MRI and CT scans, brain function through PET scans, functional MRI, and even very non-invasive tests. There's a sniff test. As people lose their cognitive abilities, they lose their ability to identify scent, odors, and even head size. If you have a larger head, you have a lower risk for the disease. So if somebody says you've got a big head, that may be a compliment. So these pathologists have looked at the buildup of the plaques and tangles, and there's a very distinct pattern of buildup that you see here. The plaques in one side and the tangles on the other side. This is a side view of the brain. And a number of years ago, a group of us at UCLA, we used PET scanning, or positron emission tomography scanning, that for the first time allowed us to visualize these plaques and tangles in the brain. And this is an animation that we created from 20 PET scans, going from normal people to people with mild cognitive impairments all the way to Alzheimer's dementia. And you see this pattern of buildup as the brain gets more red and yellow. It shows you more plaque and tangle in the brain, and the memory score worsens. And as the animation loops around, you can see people with normal aging, without dementia, we can already begin to see these abnormalities in the brain, even though the person is not impaired, which raises a lot of issues. Perhaps we'll get a chance to talk about that, in the Q&A. Now, we know something about genetics these days. When I started out, we had no genetic markers for Alzheimer's. When I started UCLA, my mentor, Lissy Jarvik, was doing a study looking at the genetics, and I collaborated with investigators from Duke University, And in that collaboration, we were able to get enough families, so we learned more about genetic risk. And so what we discovered was apolipoprotein E4, which is a variant. I call it a risk. It's a variant of a gene because it's common in the general population. 20% of us are carriers of this gene, and it means that we are at greater risk for the disease, but it's not necessary nor sufficient to get the disease. So we don't use it as a predictive test. It's used in research to see if people will respond differently to treatments and so forth. Now, there are rare genetic mutations that a number of groups have discovered, and they find them in these rare families that have what's called an autosomal dominant inheritance pattern, meaning, and you see it by this genetic tree in the figure here, means that half of people in the family get the disease, usually in their 50s or 60s early on. Now, if you come from a family like that and it's relatively rare, you could get genetic testing, see a genetic counselor. Not everybody chooses to do that. But genetics are not the whole story, and we're going to focus today on non-genetic factors that are under our control. Now, if we look at memory on the vertical axis and plot it against time or age, if we do nothing, it's a downhill slope, as you see here. Our goal is early intervention to slow things down. Unfortunately, most doctors these days do too little too late for a variety of reasons. And part of this is pushback from families who are afraid to go in and get a diagnosis. They don't intervene until later on, but we know that it's easier to protect a healthy brain rather than try to repair damage once it becomes extensive. So it's a good idea if you're concerned about your memory that you see someone sooner rather than later. Now, if we look again at this plot, this is how we understand the different degrees of cognitive impairment, and we have nomenclature for these different degrees. So I use the term normal aging. That's what we joke about. You can't find your keys, you don't recognize somebody's name right away. That tends to be pretty stable, and it's really not too worrisome until it gets more severe and people are compensating more. They develop what's called mild cognitive impairment, but they're still independent. They can compensate for their memory slips. Once they can no longer compensate and they need others for help, we call it dementia. And usually it's Alzheimer's dementia 70% of the time, but there are other problems like small strokes, Lewy body disease, sometimes medically correctable problems like a medication side effect that can look like a dementia syndrome. And we can track this with these various biomarkers that I mentioned earlier, brain scans, and neuropsychological testing, which are pencil and paper tests that psychologists can do. Now, I talked about that compensation that goes on. Susan Buchheimer and I, a number of years ago at UCLA, we did this study where we looked at people who did not have dementia, had milder cognitive issues, excuse me, and we put them in a functional MRI scanner, and we had them perform memory tasks. And what you're seeing, we had two groups of individuals, volunteers. One group had this ApoE4 genetic risk, the other group did not. And the colored areas show you where their brains were functional during the memory task. And what you see, whether or not they had the genetic risk, the same areas of the brain were activated, the frontal parts of the brain, some areas in the back of the brain. But you notice that people with the genetic risk, their brains were working harder to complete the same task. And 2 years later, we found that those whose brains worked harder had a greater likelihood of declining cognitively. So we think what happens is that we naturally compensate for these problems, but at a certain point, that compensation goes down and people develop dementia. And let me just simply define again, dementia as a cognitive impairment that interferes with your ability to care for yourself. Now, if you have this decline curve and somebody has dementia, you give them a sugar pill or placebo, they'll get worse. Now we have a number of different treatments. Actually, for decades, we've had this since the early 90s. Drugs like Aricept or rivastigmine. And it causes temporary improvement or benefit, but it doesn't change the slope of decline. More recently, we've been developing drugs that are disease modifying. They eliminate the plaque from the brain, and they too seem to have a temporary benefit, but may change the slope of decline. We're not sure yet. We haven't followed these patients long enough, and I'll talk about those drugs in just a moment. The research over the years has focused on pills, vaccines, infusions, electricity that can jumpstart neural circuits. And most of this, even insulin nasal spray, because people who develop diabetes have a twofold increased risk for Alzheimer's dementia. Most of the clinical trials have not succeeded. It's a long process. It's a very difficult process. And if you've been following the news, or if you have a family member or a friend with the disease, you probably know about some of these newer drugs where the focus on the amyloid plaques has been targeted. And, they're not perfect. The ones that are available, you have to get infusions, go to the doctor every 2 weeks or once a month. They're costly. They require an amyloid brain scan. Hopefully, we'll be able to confirm it with blood tests now, with the newer tests. And you have to monitor the brain because there are side effects. You can get blood swelling or bleeding that can cause problems. And you monitor the brain with serial MRI scans. Aducanumab was the first drug that was approved by the FDA in 2021, but it was discontinued. There was some controversy about how robust the studies were. And today we have 2 drugs that are available, lecanemab and donanemab. And these can be added to the symptomatic drugs that have been around for a while, drugs like Aricept or donepezil. Now, I've mentioned these biomarkers, and they can be helpful in tracking the disease. But sometimes you find that the biomarker improves with the treatment, as you see here. The vertical hatch line is when treatment begins, but cognition keeps getting worse. So the good news is your brain scan looks good. The bad news is you'll forget the conversation with your doctor. This is what we're looking for in biomarkers that really tell us where things are going. Now, a way to think about this, so there are biomarkers that track the disease, and there are surrogate markers that are really markers for the treatment as well. So a good surrogate marker in medicine would be a statin drug. So you go to the doctor at a certain age, if your cholesterol or if your LDL is too high, then you take a statin drug. So the surrogate marker would be the LDL level in the blood, and the statin marker would be the treatment. So it really makes a difference. If your LDL level is high, that does indicate a higher risk for a stroke or a heart attack in the future. So let's now spend some time on what we can do to mitigate these kinds of problems, healthy aging. This, by the way, is what I'd like to be doing when I'm in my 80s. Chances are I'll never do it because I haven't pole vaulted in my life. But, we can adjust our exercise program so it doesn't cause injury, and it does boost brain health and also extend life expectancy. A team of us at UCLA collaborated with Gallup to interview over 18,000 adults across the US. And not surprisingly, we found that people complained about their memory as they got older. It was more often, but even young people had some memory complaints. Healthier behavior was more common in older adults. So we looked at the diet, exercise, and so forth. And interestingly, older people were exercising and eating right more. And it makes sense. If you live a healthy lifestyle, you're going to be more likely to reach your 70s or 80s to talk to somebody who calls you up for a Gallup poll. What was interesting and what our hypothesis was that the more healthy behaviors people engaged in, the fewer their memory complaints, and also the better their mood. So even though I'm focusing here on cognition, these kinds of behaviors we'll be talking about, or lifestyle habits, boost mood as well. So we found that if you exercised regularly, you were more likely to have a good memory than if you didn't. If you also consume fruits and vegetables regularly, your memory was even better. If you didn't smoke cigarettes, it was even better, and so forth. And this approach has been looked at by the Lancet Commission over a number of years. And here we see a summary of that. They've identified 14 potential modifiable risk factors for dementia. And I've mentioned several of them, such as physical inactivity. Another risk factor is obesity, low social contact, depression, hypertension, again, could be treated readily, high LDL cholesterol, traumatic brain injury, even air pollution can increase your risk. And these are things that we can address. Now, I've been talking about this for decades. When I was at UCLA, I was appointed the first director of the Longevity Center, initially called the Center on Aging. We developed a number of programs that's still in existence. You may want to check out some of the available memory programs that are there. In fact, we developed memory classes that we license across the country. In New Jersey, at Hackensack Meridian Health, we've licensed some of these programs. They're so helpful. But it wasn't till about 10 years ago that the rest of the scientific community started to get on board that there's something to this. There's a there. And I think this study was quite important, this Finnish geriatric intervention study, where they had a large group of older people and they gave them a nutritional guidance, they had cognitive training, and they found that it really made a difference in lowering the risk for developing dementia. But there's still controversy in this area because the level of evidence varies. And so you'll see statements that 1/3 of dementia cases can be prevented within the next 25 years, and there's arguments for or against this. And it depends on the type of study that's done. If you enroll people in a prospective randomized trial, that's more convincing evidence than if you just find an association in a large epidemiological study. So let's delve in a little bit on some of these lifestyle habits and start with physical exercise, where I think there's probably the most compelling evidence there from animal studies, from human studies. Physically active older adults have a lower risk for Alzheimer's, and you don't have to become a triathlete. Just brisk walking can make a difference. And here you see data from the University of Illinois, where they took a large group of middle-aged and older people, put them on a half-hour-a-day walking program versus just stretching and toning, and they measured the size of the hippocampus, an area under the temples that encodes new memories. And you see those who had their hippocampi grow were the walkers. They had the aerobic exercise. And those over a year who just were stretching, their hippocampi shrunk. And we know that a larger brain is linked to better cognitive ability. Now, at UCLA, we did a study where we looked at sedentary behavior, and we looked at kind of a surrogate marker for physical inactivity, and that's the number of hours per day you sit. And we found that there was, in people with mild cognitive impairment and controls, which are people with normal aging, there was a significant correlation between reported hours a day sitting and smaller medial temporal lobes, which is where the hippocampus sits. So a lot of people are getting these standing desks and walking desks. If you get one, I think you should be careful training with it because you're going to be multitasking and you run the risk of slipping and falling. And you definitely don't want to hit your head. So another study that really, a much larger study that confirmed what we found was from the UK Biobank, where they had nearly 50,000 adults. And here, instead of just reported sitting, they actually had accelerometers that people wore on their wrists, and they followed these people for years. And sure enough, more time spent in sedentary behaviors was significantly associated with higher rates of dementia. It reminds me of an article I read today in the New York Times about how, in the US, we may not be doing our exercise right. We get into our cars, drive to the gym and exercise, and there are other ways of doing it. For example, in Finland, everybody is walking everywhere. despite the cold. So it's something to keep in mind to get up and go any chance you get. Now, what about building brain muscle through mental exercise? There's some compelling data there as well. Mental stimulation activates neural circuits, lowers risk for Alzheimer's, whether it's going to college, attending a lecture like this, or learning languages. These are all associated with lower dementia risk. So there's the mental stimulation, which is helpful, but also we can learn specific memory techniques that can mitigate age-related cognitive decline, compensate for it. And I'm going to give you an example from my books in just a moment. Here, there's another large-scale study looking at over 10,000 people, older people, and so many different ways you can reduce your risk for dementia: writing letters, using the computer, taking classes, even artistic activities will lower your dementia risk. And when you look at these kinds of interventions, if we take, for example, cognitive training, learning these specific tasks, I'll show you in just a moment, they have a greater or lesser impact depending on the degree of cognitive impairment. So they have the best effect. What the Longevity Center has developed are a lot of classes for people with just normal aging, mild issues. But the more advanced people, there are programs for them. The memory care program, which also helps a lot of people. So, big issue is technology today. I remember for years people complaining that they can't remember phone numbers anymore. What I tell them is don't worry about remembering phone numbers, use your device, but learn techniques that will help you in everyday life. And sometimes the computer can definitely help, or phones can help with a lot of information, but there's an age gap. There's the digital natives and the digital immigrants, older people who come to the technology later in life and a little resistant to adopting it. This is the kind of technology they like, old school. But it's changing. But there's still a lot in the lay literature. Is Google making us stupid? And if there's any digital natives in the audience, just point out stupid is intentionally misspelled. And we did a study, Your Brain on Google at UCLA, where we wanted to see what happens to the brain when we search online. So we put people again in the functional MRI scanner. We gave them special goggles. We had them search online when they were in the scanner, so we could see where the brain was working. So this is what the brain looked like when people were reading a book. But when people had experience searching online, their brains were having a party, a twofold increase. And we even found that people who were naive to internet searching, after a week of just spending an hour a day, they could activate their neural circuits. So this is just an example how neural activity can be stimulated by these kinds of games. And there's studies looking at other types of games. Here's one that boosts our working memory. It's very short-term memory that you use to hold information in mind, just long enough to work it, to solve problems and so forth. And it's a bit like, the old game of concentration where you turn a card and another card, you try to remember what the cards are. But this is concentration on steroids, because you have to remember an object where it is on the grid and also a sound. And it turns out when people play this game, which is not a lot of fun, it's a lot of mental work, but if you stick with it, it will improve your short-term working memory for problem solving, and it will transfer to what we call fluid intelligence, a form of IQ and reasoning ability. It's been tested in young people and older people, and it really works. Or there are games like keeping a race car on a windy road while informative or distracting road signs pop up and down. So it teaches your brain to multitask. And after a few weeks, you can train a 70-year-old to perform like an untrained 20-year-old. And those benefits seem to last. And we know that technology, if it's used right, can improve visual attention and reaction time. In fact, surgeons who play video games make fewer errors in the operating room. So think about that next time you have to have elective surgery. Don't ask about the diplomas, ask about the number of hours of video gaming per week. Now, I just want to make one comment, I see I don't have any slides on the downside of technology, and I'm constantly, I've been publishing on that with colleagues, and there's a lot of interest in the media about that. And, you know, too much of a good thing is not a good thing. When I think there's a lot of issues where people overuse the technology, they get distracted, and that, again, doesn't help your memory. So the key is to use it wisely so that it boosts your brain health and supports successful longevity rather than distracts you from that. So, you know, over the years at UCLA, we studied and developed all these programs. We did a study looking at a 6-week memory fitness program, and older people in independent living and assisted living had showed significant improvements in memory. We put people on a 2-week healthy lifestyle program, and not only did it improve memory, they learned the memory techniques, but it also changed their neural function. We saw greater efficiency in the front part of the brain. So what are the most common complaints people have? Names and faces, 85% of them as they reach their 60s complain about that. Memory places, forgetting an appointment or plan, and the tip of the tongue phenomenon, where that name doesn't roll off the tip of your tongue, but it comes to you later. And my wife Gigi and I have written over a dozen books on these topics, just talked about it for years, developed these programs where there are methods to compensate for these issues. And so in our first book, The Memory Bible, which was updated a year or two ago, we introduced Look, Snap, Connect. So all you have to do is remember these 3 methods. Look, actively observe what you want to learn. The biggest reason people don't remember is they're simply distracted. Snap, create a mental snapshot of what you want to recall later. That leverages the brain's visual memory. And finally, connect, link up those mental snapshots so they have meaning. If you can make something meaningful, it will be memorable. So how does it work? Take names and faces. You meet Harry, he's got a lot of hair. It helps you remember his name and face. Lisa has a subtle Mona Lisa smile, and so that helps you remember her name. And Mrs. Bangle has bangs. That helps. And during the course of your conversation, she tells you she's an attorney, and that helps you remember her first name. Now, while you're stressing out about these memory techniques, keep in mind that stress is the enemy of memory. Animal and human studies show that. Human studies, they inject volunteers with the stress hormone cortisol, and they find temporary memory impairment. But the good news is meditation, Tai Chi, different relaxation techniques can not only improve your mood, but also improve your memory. And 10 minutes a day seems to make a difference. Helen Labreski at UCLA has done a lot of these studies, and I'm just showing images of brain functional MRI scans showing areas that vary depending on whether somebody learns to meditate or learns different relaxation methods. Sleep, critically important. 1 out of every 3 people suffers from insomnia. You just don't get enough sleep. Shortens your life expectancy and increases your risk for dementia. And it's harder to regulate your mood, cope with stress. And these are stressful times. We need our sleep. Cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia is a first-line treatment these days, where you don't have to take medication to get a good night's sleep. Staying connected socially, critically important, helps you reduce anxiety and depression, improve your self-esteem, lowers risk for cognitive decline and depression. You know, if you have empathic friends, you talk about what's bothering you, lowers your stress level, and just having a conversation increases those neural circuits and improves your memory performance. With nutrition, we've got to think about not eating too much, because midlife obesity increases the risk for late life dementia, particularly that central obesity around the abdominal organs. There are very active fats there that we think heightens inflammation in the brain. Omega-3 fats from fish and nuts lowers inflammation and good for cognitive performance, as are antioxidant fruits and vegetables, proteins that are associated with lower risk for cognitive decline compared to carbohydrates. And a lot of different diets have been shown to be beneficial. Most of these are Mediterranean-style diets that emphasize fish, vegetable consumption. They seem to have the greatest protective effect. But, you know, we're not going in the right direction when you look at evolution and body weight. The first studies that have been done looked at bariatric surgery patients, and they found that after 12 weeks of bariatric surgery to reduce weight, that these obese individuals not only had less weight, but they had significantly better memory, and those benefits were maintained for several years. And now there have been newer studies showing that you don't have to undergo surgery to improve. We did a study with Dr. David Merrill on these modifiable risk factors, looking at, you know, this brain scan that we invented. I showed you those images earlier, FDDMP PET, and we looked at people with mild cognitive impairment. And here SMI means normal aging. And you can see if you look at people that had an adherence to a healthy diet, and these are all people that don't have dementia. These are people with the milder memory complaints. There's a difference. You have less Alzheimer's in your brain if you adhere to a healthy diet, if you are physically active, and if you have a lower body mass index, which is an indication of less obesity. Well, I mentioned inflammation, and you know, I've always been someone who's embraced heightened inflammation as a real driver of cognitive decline and even, you know, shortened longevity, because it's associated with so many chronic medical diseases. We know that normal inflammation, you know, helps us repair tissue damage, fight off infections. But the problem is that as we age, if we become overweight, there's too much inflammation. We think that those inflammatory cells and proteins are actually destroying the function of healthy brain cells. And a lot of these lifestyle behaviors, like a good night's sleep, consuming omega-3 fats, physical exercise, actually lower inflammation in the brain. So another point I just want to make with the interventions that we've been developing over the years, some of these interventions seem to work when people are at a milder stage of decline, but don't work at a later stage of decline. And so we leverage that knowledge in some of our studies trying to reduce inflammation. And this one's supported by the National Institute of Health, was one where we took celecoxib or Celebrex and gave it to middle-aged and older people who had mild memory complaints over an 18-month period, where we gave them placebo. And we found it helped with their cognition and helped with their brain scans. Now, the problem with anti-inflammatory drugs, they have a lot of side effects. And other studies have shown that these drugs really aren't helpful in people who already have dementia. So there's a tipping point where they might not be so helpful. And we don't want to expose people to all these side effects. So our group looked for safer approaches, and we came across a spice, curcumin, which is part of turmeric. And we got a bioavailable form of it. We tested it again in mild people over 18 months and found a significant benefit. And the name, you know, you can actually, if you're more interested in this study, just search, and this will be good for your brain, search curcumin UCLA memory, and you'll see the press release and the link to the actual study. We've engaged the Asian company that has this compound, this particular theracurcumin compound, and they're going to be funding a confirmation study in New Jersey and also at UCLA with the Human Nutrition Center. Other strategies to keep in mind, in addition to avoiding head trauma and not smoking, keep a positive outlook. It's infectious. It'll extend your life expectancy. And again, those deal with your medical care. Treating hypertension, high cholesterol will help you live better and longer. Now, getting to the question I posed, can we prevent Alzheimer's? Well, if you define prevention as cure, the answer is no. But we can delay the onset and slow progression to keep people healthier longer. So if they cross this line and develop dementia, you know, we think we can get them gains of several years, which can be very meaningful. And to emphasize that point about these strategies not only helping cognition, but they help mood, depression, anxiety, substance use disorder, work-related stress, the UK Biobank data, over 300,000 people. They found even people at high genetic risk with that ApoE4 carrier status, a favorable lifestyle, such as not smoking, exercising, eating a healthy diet, moderate alcohol intake, and avoiding obesity, that was associated with a nearly 50% lower relative risk of depression than an unfavorable lifestyle. So how do we help people to change? Well, we're trying to do that right now. Number one is educate. You know, if you know that having broccoli or spinach as a side dish is better for you than French fries, you're more likely to do that. You want to engage in programs that are fun and easy. A few years ago, Gigi and I wrote a book, 2 Weeks to a Younger Brain. If we had called it 2 Years to a Younger Brain, trust me, no one would purchase it. But 2 weeks is just enough time to get on a program, to see that it actually makes you feel better. That gets you into the lifestyle because it's about the long haul to make a difference. And then we have to look to motivate people. You know, just if you go on a diet and you get on the scale, you lost a couple pounds, you're motivated to continue. So we do that in our memory training classes or in our books by giving people quizzes. And let's see how well you do. Who is this? Okay, if you said Harry, you're right. How about this person? That's right, it's Lisa. Now let me just, full disclosure, it's not a perfect technique. You may call her Mona the first time. I remember once meeting Mr. Astoria, and I almost called him Mr. Waldorf the next time I saw him, because you can imagine what my mnemonic was there. And of course, those of you who've ever had legal difficulties will remember Sue Bangle's name very quickly, because that's an emotional memory. You've been sued. So key points, we've got diagnostic and treatment approaches that help us at this point. We're still doing some drug development in the area, but you know, we can embrace these brain healthy habits today, improve the quality of our life, possibly stave off Alzheimer's disease, and even mitigate depression and anxiety and other mental symptoms. So let me stop the share at this point. And let's see what kind of, oh goodness, we have 23 questions and no answers yet. Let's see how well I can do here. Thank you for your attention. So the first question is about the blue zones. This has been questioned. What is your understanding of the validity of this? Well, you know, it's interesting. Those of you who are unfamiliar with it, there are areas in the world, Sardinia, Italy, some areas of Costa Rica, even close to UCLA. There are people who live a certain lifestyle where they are, you know, engaging in physical exercise, they have close social connections and so forth. The blue zones, and there are a lot of people who live to be 100 in those areas. It's not absolute proof, it's kind of an association that confirms data from other more compelling studies like the finger study that I shared with you. This is somebody, Dr. Nina Kraft says that she thinks she was my intern with Lissy Jarvik back in the day. Hi, Nina. Nice to hear from you. Can we have the audio higher, please? Oops, that might have been my bad. Yeah, it could have been higher. I'm sorry. Here's a little better audio. Okay, let's move on. Is there an effective test to identify early symptoms of Alzheimer's? Well, you know, the early symptoms, the challenge with early symptoms is that they look like normal aging. So what I advise to people, if you're concerned about your early symptoms, go see a specialist, or even start with your primary care doctor, and they can do some simple screening tests and look into it further. I mean, they can reassure you that you don't have anything serious that's going to progress, or if there is a problem, they can begin an early intervention. So what is the sniff test? With this sniff test, what they do, they have, it's kind of a scratch and sniff type of device where they scratch the surface and then an odor comes up, and then the patient is supposed to identify the odor. Is this coffee? Is this a peach? And so forth. And they have a whole rating scale, how they perform. So what about over-the-counter things like Neuriva and Prevagen have any effect? Here, I've been consulting to the supplement industry for years. And, there are some supplements out there that have ingredients that have data. And what I look for are these double-blind placebo-controlled studies. So the question is not whether in a test tube it does something to nerve cells, but if you have people with memory complaints who get the active ingredient versus those who don't, you actually see a statistically significant difference. And so the two that you asked about with Neuriva, they do have an ingredient there, phosphatidylserine, that shows an effect. So I would say that's probably something that works. I mentioned the theracurmin, where we have that study that showed it. Prevagen, not so much. I mean, they've done the double-blind studies show that people who take Prevagen get better in the Prevagen group, but they didn't find a statistically significant difference with the placebo group. So here, nowadays, people said in 10 years, AI can cure any disease. Do you believe that? How is the future of curing by AI? It's just, it's hard to predict the future. I think AI is very exciting, but also it's a bit scary. I saw Terminator 1, 2, and 3, and it's feasible that the AI in the wrong hands could not be good. But whether it's AI or something else, I think there is, I'm excited about the future. If we keep our wits about us, if we invest in the right scientific approaches, I think we can hopefully see a cure. Even if it isn't a cure, we can, we look at what's happened with cancer. There are many cancers now with early detection and treatment. In a sense, there's a cure if you get a 5-year survival on that. So I think with Alzheimer's, it's a complex disease. There's probably going to be lots of different mechanisms that contribute into it. And I'm very optimistic we're going to see safer and more effective treatments into the future. So here's a question, elevated risk of dementia among the deaf, hearing impaired from both populations. Well, that's something I can't remember. That's not a good thing from the memory doctor, but I think in the 14 modifiable risk factors from the Lancet Commission, they include hearing impairment. If not, there are studies showing that diminished hearing does contribute. And so that's another important thing that we can correct. You can get a hearing aid, and the technology there is much improved. Now, why would people have more cognitive decline with hearing impairment? Because of that social disconnection. When you're connected socially, you're talking to people, you're energizing and stimulating your neural connections, which is very helpful. So are these apps available to everyone? And I'm not sure which apps you're referring to. I showed some games. I believe the one that helped with working memory, if you search IQ Boost, you'll find something like that. And the same thing with apps. You see apps advertised. It's a little bit like the supplement business. Some of these are just kind of fun, fancy toys. Others have been tested. Now, it is possible that the fun, fancy toys are going to help you. I tend to lean towards things that are vetted through the scientific method. So tech and gaming too much. Well, I think, and this applies not just to tech, but even to doing crossword puzzles, whatever you do, words with friends. And I do a lot of these puzzles. I've been doing crosswords for years just because I enjoy them. And the latest studies show, hey, it's helping my brain. Maybe that's contributing to this, my acuity in this lecture today. The key is to train but not strain your brain. So in other words, find mental activities, whether it's an app or a video game or puzzles, whatever it may be, that are fun and engaging, and get you to try to test yourself a bit. If it's too easy, it's going to be boring and just routine, and it's not going to do much for you. And that's where tech can be bad, where people spend hours and hours just scrolling through their social media feeds and just kind of waste time. If it's too difficult, it's going to be daunting and it's not going to be fun. It's going to be stressful. So you got to find that sweet spot that works for you. So psilocybin mushrooms for neurodegeneration. I think there have been some early reports suggesting there might be something. Right now, psychedelic therapies are, serious scientists at academic centers are testing them more for intractable depression, PTSD, those kinds of conditions. There could be a there. I think even with cannabis, there's a cannabis research initiative at UCLA, and I started looking at some of these issues with older adults because so many of my patients were using cannabis products for sleep, for pain, and so forth, but there wasn't a lot of research there. There are ingredients of cannabis, and CBD can certainly mitigate anxiety and pain. THC, even that in some models, they could have a cognitive benefit. The problem is finding the right subject where there's an intervention, the right dosing, and also what could be side effects, the mental expanding effects. Is there evidence that statins increase risk of dementia? I think this will be the last one because we're coming to the end of the hour. Sorry, I couldn't get to all the questions. You may have heard that sometimes somebody takes a statin drug and it affects their memory. And if that happens, it will happen initially when you take it. It's a minority of patients. You need to talk to your doctor and maybe get a different statin or find another way to control your cholesterol. But in general, if you take a statin, it's going to lower your cholesterol to a normal level, and that's going to prevent cognitive decline. So that's a good thing. That's a medical treatment that helps. So with that last question, let me turn it over to the moderators. And thank you for what a wonderful list of questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of them, but they were really spot on.
Thank you, Dr. Small. Again, on behalf of all of us, I want to give you a virtual applause because, wow, just so full of science and research, but then also great tips and suggestions for how to take action. And so thank you for taking the time. You're on Eastern time, and so thank you for joining us. Also thank you for all the amazing work you've done in this topic and also at UCLA, just the amazing amount of knowledge that was created through your work. We are so proud that you're an alumnus, but then also just so proud that you continue to do this great work.
Yeah, thank you, the kind words. I'm in my second act right now, but look out for my third act. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. To everyone you've asked around a recording, we'll send out a recording when it's available so that you have access to what Dr. Small presented and also the slides that he shared through the recording. And so thank you everyone for joining us. We hope that you have a great rest of your day and go Bruins. Take care, everyone.